Exactly, 12. Hi, everybody. I can't see any of you. I'm going to read about my ex-landlord, who's no longer alive. This was this is an edited version. The full thing is on Gothmist, if anyone wants to read the rest. It's called Is Max. The first time I met Max Stark was the first time he came to the door to collect the rent, around 13 years before his brutal murder in early 2014. The urgent ding-dong, 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 ding-dong became known quickly among the residents of 315 Siegel Street as the landlord knock. The bell depressed so quickly that it didn't have time to ring so much as wheeze percussively. It was imitated widely. Max arrived with his partner Sam, and for the first while I wasn't sure which bearded Hasid was which. They looked like a comedy team of sorts, an orthodox Laurel and Hardy. Sam tall and bearded, Max short and bearded. With his Yiddish accent, I was never sure if he knew my name or if he was calling me Jason. We all developed imitations of Max's particular type of matter-of-fact landlordism. Jason, hello, how are you? Goes mine, with a friendly palm-up waves of both hands. When Max was abducted from a Williamsburg street during a snowstorm, his body found burned in a dumpster and his business dealings reported in the New York tabloids, I learned that Sam was Israel Perlmutter and that Max was actually Menachem, and that many people considered them slumlords. Who didn't want him dead, the Post asked on the cover. One answer to that question is my friends and me, Max's tenants in the 3-story loft building directly upstairs from the Morgan Avenue L train stop. I don't doubt a single one of the accusations leveled against Max, except for the one that he was heartless. I know that to be false. Most of us moved in during the early summer of 2001 and lived there for the next decade. It'd be wrong to call Max beloved, but he could border on endearing and he was far from hated. He was just the landlord, and a pretty tolerable one at that. Max was a nearly daily presence in our lives during those years as the Morgan Avenue stop transformed around us from the East Williamsburg Industrial Park into an extreme model of Brooklyn gentrification, complete with a world-renowned pizza and greenhouse complex. The last time I was in the neighborhood, an ad for the Bill Murray Christmas special adorned the side of my old building, which until about a month or two before we took up residence had been the A.M. Knitwear Corporation. Those were the buildings for the new or for the broke or for the new and broke, recalls a former real estate broker who occasionally worked with Max on buildings in other parts of Williamsburg. Seasoned New Yorkers were not calling me to move into those places. Max was really one of the first people to take a chance on converting those industrial buildings, had the foresight to buy them when they were cheap, and understood what the people renting those units really wanted in terms of space and finish. He went into areas where people thought he was crazy. At least in the experience of myself and most of the other dozen former neighbors I remain in touch with, Max wasn't a slumlord. He was just an opportunistic real estate investor from Williamsburg. If something went wrong in the building, he was always easy to get on the phone. From what I can discern, 315 was one of his earliest projects, and perhaps treated it and us with some fondness because of it. I'm not sure what else he owned at the time, but it couldn't have been much. Max was a pretty funny guy, says Mark Supes, a freelance programmer who moved in just before me. There was something about his demeanor that was almost comical, and almost felt like he was in on the joke, too. We discovered at some point that he was basically our age, and we were all shocked because we assumed he must have been much older than us. It's hard to say that Max had a twinkle in his eye exactly, but he did not have one either. While Max benevolently looked the other way, 315 Siegel Street became an incubator for the new Brooklyn. He was like the Y Combinator dude for the East Coast, says Joey Enough, an early Wired employee and co-founder of the pioneering internet snark dispensary Suck.com, the unheralded Orthodox Jewish Paul Graham of Bushwick, but more rock and roll. Every third tenant had a band. That was half the reason people got places there. There was no conceivable way a neighbor of anybody on that block would complain about something loud. The 3-story loft at 315 Siegel was a constant sitcom, co-starring Max Stark as the beleaguered, bemused landlord. The place smelled like a bongwater swamp from the moment you stepped in the front door, which I always assumed, not illogically, that it was due to the sheer volume of weed smoke. After I moved out, I found out that my side of the second floor alone contained 2 pot growing operations, and that's not to mention the dealers, of which there were at least 2 on each floor. There were biker hipsters who arrived just before the 2004 Republican National Convention, and in building lore are the ones to blame when the bedbugs arrived. They never made it to my room, thankfully, either the bikers or the bedbugs. There were musicians, artists, and a glassblower, and students and teachers, and environmentalists, and house painters, and a music business accountant, and more. The building even had its own male model, who, just like in Zoolander, outfitted his room with a half-pipe for him and his skateboarding buddies. Mark recently spotted him on a knockoff billboard in Thailand. When Joey landed a job at VH1, our hall had its own TV producer, too. Recall, a family moved in with kids upstairs. briefly. Recalls one friend, I remember doing mushrooms with some friends who came to visit, and we took a kettle of mine and were throwing it down the hall like a bowling ball. For all intents and purposes, the building was lawless. The old yarn that New York is always cooler before you moved here might be true, but the 10 years I got at Siegel Street gave me exactly what I expected and wanted out of New York, which was chaos. And it was Max Stark who made that possible. In that way, the building became one of the infinite amount of pivot points between the crazy old New York and its more buffed up post-9/11 iteration. Or it could just be me. The DIY architecture sprouted quickly. The way it stayed cheap as possible was the subdivision of spaces into cubbies, says Joey. If you watched a show like Girls, or any show that aspires to depict the day-to-day of hipster living, that's an element that's missing. The no-window cubby, the little fortress room. Some rooms, like one upstairs with undulating plastic bedroom capsules, were inspired. Other rooms looked more like tree forts. One of the early tenants moved out after a year or so, and Joey happened to be there the day Max gave his goodbye inspection, and the VH1 producer couldn't believe what he saw. I'd never seen anything like the architecture that existed in this loft, he says. In the middle of the unit, he built what can only describe as a small replica of the shantytown in Robert Altman's Popeye movie. In one spot, he built a superstructure to conceal the fact that there was now an interior structure, which was a pot grow room, masked by a larger structure which he posited as the bedroom. But neither structure was anything more than a basic post-millennial Hooverville. It was something that feral humans might live in out in the woods, says Joey. Meanwhile, the tenant was trying to get his deposit back from Max. He was arguing that the whole structure represented an $800 home improvement. It was blowing my mind, says Joey. I was just openly laughing hysterically out loud. Max couldn't even show the place with it. It would have to be demolished, burnt, and aerated before it could be fit to show a realtor, let alone a tenant. That was the kind of shit he must have seen all the time. If your average American 20-something wanted to prove conclusively to someone who identified as an immigrant that this was not a place of dreams, that this was a place you should flee, that's what Max got at every tenant visit, says Joey. Different ways that the American dream could fail. Max had a genuine curiosity about his tenants, Joey continues. I talked to him about making television. He was really curious about television. He didn't own a television. It was prohibited by his religion, but he thought it was a really interesting concept. He was definitely not the only person I met in Bushwick who didn't own a television and told me that, but he was definitely the least judgmental about it. Like others who speak Eastern European languages, Max would often drop the article from his sentences, though I sometimes wondered if he was doing it deliberately. Is Max, he would announce on voicemails, and this eventually became the hook of a song recorded by building resident Lawrence Becker, now professional animator, and his roommates. Many relished Saturdays, the one day our landlords were guaranteed not to come knocking. He was a softie, recalls Emily Dean, a solar energy consultant who moved into the building a few years later after spending time there. We'd have really cordial dealings, but I gave Max a lot of flack because he wouldn't shake my hand. One neighbor went a whole year without paying Max once. The building received its certificate of occupancy by then, and Max could have evicted him, but didn't. He did, however, make my broke friend's life a living hell, showing up nearly each morning to do the landlord knock and haranguing him endlessly, as he deserved. Others remember Max playing the good cop. There were times when we were months behind, owing them thousands of dollars, and the woman at the office was threatening eviction, moving forward with filing papers, remembers Derek Dickinson, who got the spot in the building as a student and remained afterwards as he became a contractor. Max would be the one who was cool to me. He'd call me and say, "You're killing me. I have to leave the office to talk to you. They want you out." He was our advocate. Mark Supes pushed it to the limit. Quitting his freelance programming gig, Supes launched Zip Menu, a web-based food delivery startup that started up about a half-decade too early. He eventually sold out to Delivery.com, but not before Zip Menu crashed and burned. Once one of Max's more reliable tenants, Supes far fell behind with Max, who could be relentless in hunting late rent and often just seemed to enjoy the chase. After the damage had been done, I was pretty hard up, Mark says. My utilities got cut off. No electric, no hot water, the refrigerator stops working, no heat. But I'm also trying to run a startup the best I can, and I've got a pretty big computer rig to power up. So I just ran an extension cord out the door and put it into an adapter in the light fixture. At one point, Max came by to collect the rent, which I didn't have, and saw that there was an extension cord running up to the ceiling, plugged into the power, and he just looks at me and goes, "Mark, why do you do this to me?" I think it challenged all he knew about reality to know that there were people as bad with money as his tenants, Joey says. In the end, though, it seems like he was the worst of all. But that just makes you wonder if anybody could be good with money. If not Max, then who? If he didn't have this shit together, then the whole world is probably a sham. By the end of my tenancy at 315 Siegel Street, my share of the rent had risen to nearly $800. I still saw Max, but he stopped coming around for the rent. Instead, he started sending the super. who neither employed the telltale landlord knock nor spoke much English. Instead, like a surrogate, he would simply hand me a cell phone, and on the other end I'd find the unamused representative from the real estate office demanding money immediately. Eventually I stopped accepting the phone. When I moved out, it happened to be nearby Max's developments on South 4th Street, and I ran into him in the neighborhood frequently in the months before he was killed by somebody that he had not paid. I can't actually recall if I gave him shit about pricing me out of my new neighborhood too, but I think I did. Certainly intended to. Now, 2 years after his death, I'm sad he can't create any more chaos. Max Stark deserves a Coen Brothers script, or as Joey Enough suggests, at least a season of Serial. My last concrete memory of Max is coming home one day to find him talking to my current landlord in front of my new place, both with smiles on their faces. Max greeted me warmly, though I was never sure if he knew my name or mispronounced it because of his accent. "Max has nothing but nice things to say about you," my new landlord said. "He says you always paid your rent on time." It's possible Max actually winked.